welcome to our last video on muscle. We'll be exploring exercise physiology and energetics. We'll be exploring how muscle health and posture are incredibly important. We'll look at and compare muscle tone and strength, consider different types of contractions, and also look a little bit at physics of our muscles, so considering tension, force, and velocity. We'll also look at energy pathways, and compare and contrast fatigue and soreness. We'll begin by talking about some of the benefits of exercise, such as increasing strength and muscle tone, definitely reducing illness such as heart disease. It'll increase your bone density to prevent osteoporosis. It'll definitely improve our sleep and mental health, increase our stamina and metabolism. And honestly, there's just so many different benefits to exercise. We just can't list them all here, but that was just a few. One of the overarching benefits of exercise is that it improves our muscle tone. Now, in this image, you see someone who's got very shapely arms, and you can definitely see all of the muscles. But really, muscle tone is more about our muscles' ability to resist any kind of stretching. And basically, it describes how our muscles remain in a somewhat contracted state even at rest. Now, it's very low energy. It's not all of your muscles contracting, but ultimately, the contraction of these muscle fibers will help to maintain our posture and basically give our body shape and to help support all of our internal organs. Ultimately, with our muscles having some tone to them, it's going to be ready at any moment in which we do need to have a sudden contraction. Ultimately, if you do not exercise, your muscles will begin to atrophy. It's a state of condition in which the muscle fibers will actually start to decrease in size. You can see that on the image here. This can often occur after someone has been in a wheelchair or in a cast for quite a bit of time. Having significantly poor muscle tone is known as hypotonia. Sometimes it's an indicator that there could be a nervous system disorder. As you can see in this image, there are babies being tested for hypotonia in order to determine whether or not they are reaching the correct stages of growth and development. Good muscle tone improves our posture to make sure that our body is upright and balanced. This ultimately ensures that our body mechanics are exactly the way it should be. Our bones are aligned to reduce any kind of pressure that could ultimately hurt potentially other muscles, and it will also ensure that our breathing and our blood flow is more efficient. Exercises that work on strengthening core muscles such as the biceps femoris, the gluteals, the rectus femoris, that psoas muscle that's deep in the core of our body, as well as any of our abdominal muscles, will improve our overall muscle tone. Muscle strength, by contrast, actually describes the ability of our muscles to be able to contract against any kind of resisting force, such as lifting up a gallon of milk. There are a few factors that will affect our strength. For instance, our muscles are actually composed of different types of fibers. We have these fibers that are called fast twitch, which are able to provide a strong force or high force, but yet will only last for a very short period of time, such as throwing a ball, for instance. We also have slow twitch types of fibers, and these are the ones that don't require a whole lot of force, but will act for a long amount of time, such as with running. Obviously, our muscle mass, the amount of fibers that we have, will increase our overall strength. In addition, our bone length, or the length of our arms or legs, will also provide a variable for how strong our muscles are. So ultimately, the shorter your arm is, the better force you will have to be able to apply onto some object. You can improve your muscle strength by doing any sort of resistance training, such as lifting weights, but you don't just need weights. You can also use your body's natural resistance, such as with push-ups, as well as climbing mountains, for instance. we're going to take a little look at the physics and mechanics of muscles and their contractions so that way we can get a better understanding of how muscles work. So if we look here, we have a weight in the hand, and that's going to be an example of some kind of a resistance, but resistance can even be body resistance. And so when our muscles contract, really what they're doing is they're applying a tension force. And so in order for movement to actually occur, that tension force must be much larger than the resistance force acting on the insertion site, which will ultimately move. As we learn, contractions are a result of the interaction between our actin and myosin filaments. Here we're going to be looking at 3 different types of contraction. So the first type of contraction here is when the tension force is much greater than the resistance, which will cause the shortening of the muscle ultimately. So in the case of a barbell, we're basically causing a flexion here. Now, an eccentric contraction will result when the tension is much less than the resistance. So basically, we're going to be lowering that barbell down, ultimately lengthening. Now, our muscles are still there's still some contraction happening. It's just that we're slowly lowering that barbell. Now, an isometric contraction is occurring when we are not lowering or lifting up that barbell, but yet just holding onto that barbell, and our muscles will remain in a contracted state. No movement happening at all. Another way that we can think about contractions and forces is in terms of just how much that resistance force is. So for instance, in an example of concentric contractions, if the force is much, much larger, it's actually going to be much more difficult to lift that weight, for instance, and cause the velocity or the rate of movement to be much, much smaller, as opposed to the eccentric contraction, in which the force is much larger. It's definitely going to be much easier and have a much greater rate of movement, such as when you lower that barbell down, a very heavy barbell, it's going to move with a much greater force. Some examples of some pretty abnormal contractions that could occur, one of which is called tetanus, and this is why we would go and get a tetanus shot against this microbial that could cause this. So tetanus is a frequent, pretty much non-stop contraction, and it can become pretty painful as a result. Some other examples of abnormal contraction would be something like a spasm, which is pretty sudden and involuntary, like twitch, but it's pretty powerful, usually due to an electrolyte imbalance. Cramping is another one as well, but it could be pretty spasmic, kind of similar to something that was more tetanus-like. Now, rigor mortis is a condition that occurs post-mortem or after someone dies, and this is due to the fact that the ATP is no longer being produced, and therefore our myosin will stay in contact with the actin in a continuous contraction. A quick summary on muscle fiber contractions. So muscle fibers will contract in a manner in which it's all or none. So that means that as soon as the muscles are stimulated, it is just going to contract. And the force ultimately will depend on just how many fibers actually get stimulated. You're not going to have like a partially stimulated muscle fiber. And so obviously the more fibers that end up contracting will result in a much greater muscle tension and therefore movement. In order for muscles to contract, we're definitely going to need some energy. And as we learned in Module 1, that energy is going to come directly from ATP. Now, the energy results when that ATP bond is broken, releasing that energy to that myosin head. However, that energy is only going to last for just a few seconds, but our muscles will store just enough energy just to kind of get you going. And then as soon as that's done, we're going to need to find another energy source. There are 3 types of energy sources to replenish that ATP that's just been used. The first one is direct phosphorylation, in which our muscles are going to store this compound known as creatine phosphate. And so as soon as that ATP has been used, the creatine phosphate is going to donate a phosphate over to the ADP, However, that's not going to give us a whole lot of energy either. It'll probably give us another 30 seconds of energy during any kind of like a quick sprinting kind of action. Once our creatine phosphate stores are depleted, we're going to need to tap into another energy source coming directly from our glucose molecule. So our muscles will store a little bit of glucose inside of them. They're going to break that down and convert it into some ATP, but we're only going to get 2 molecules of ATP from that one glucose molecule. It's not a whole lot, but it's going to give us a quick burst of energy just to get us going. And we're going to need to tap into some other energy stores. The only problem with that is it's also going to produce this compound known as lactic acid, which could result in muscle fatigue if we do not get some other energy stores. Now, the last pathway is known as aerobic respiration. It's essentially using glucose as well, but this process takes just a little bit longer and does require lots of oxygen as well as enough mitochondria to support this process. So basically, we're going to take that glucose, we're going to break it down, and the byproduct of that is going to be pyruvic acid or pyruvate. That pyruvate will ultimately move into the mitochondria along with some oxygen, and it's going to produce tons of ATP. So we're going to get about 36 molecules, give or take a few, with just 1 molecule of glucose. But that process does take a bit longer, but ultimately it will provide us with the most amount of energy, and that energy will sustain us for about 3 minutes or so of some pretty intense exercise. To have the best aerobic respiration quality as possible, it's going to require that our muscles are well packed with mitochondria, as well as this molecule known as myoglobin, which is going to be our oxygen carrying molecule, very similar to the hemoglobin found inside of our red blood cells. Now I want to go over some common misconceptions regarding muscle fatigue and soreness. So muscle fatigue is caused because of that lactic acid buildup. So for instance, if you were doing wall squats and your thighs start to really burn, and that's because of the lactic acid buildup. But that's not going to last for very long, that pain. As soon as you stop, the oxygen will replenish and the lactic acid will just sort of go away. But the muscle soreness, however, this is caused because of these little micro tears within your muscles. Now, not a big deal, these small tears, because ultimately your muscles will rebuild, replenish, replace those torn muscles, and will try to overcompensate by building more muscle mass. That's where that real strength starts to come into play. So in summary, the effects of exercise on muscle will ultimately increase your muscle size and strength, as well as its efficiency. So the more you use it, your muscles are going to start to incorporate a lot more mitochondria in order to build more of your endurance, and those micro tears that occur are going to build more mass to improve your strength. This will ultimately result in your muscles becoming more fatigue resistant.